Stephen, what of the night? Russia and Israel prior to Armageddon.
Thank you, Brother Tim, and good evening, brothers and sisters and young people. Well, things are happening, are they not? A lot of things happening in our world, and especially in Eurasia. And you're all aware of the things that have been happening in the Ukraine over the last few weeks. So tonight I want to address Russia and Israel prior to Armageddon and have a look at the prophecies and what they require, and see if we can match what's happening with what those prophecies require. It's very important when you come to deal with Bible prophecy that you do what Brother Thomas did. He interpreted prophecy on what he read in the scripture, not on the basis of what he saw happening around him. Things can be seeming to go in the wrong direction, but if you understand prophecy, you know the direction they'll go in due course. So when you can match what's actually happening with what God said would happen, then you can get very excited about that, because you're actually watching Bible prophecy being fulfilled. Well, what does Ezekiel 38 require? We'll come to Habakkuk chapter 2 in a moment, because we want to talk about the character of Russia's current dictator, because it's there in Habakkuk 2. But of course we know that Ezekiel 38, and I don't really need to tell this audience too much about that chapter. Ezekiel 38 requires that a dictator dominates the Eurasian continent, that the territory east and north of Israel will be under Gogian control, verses 5 and 6 tell us that a dependent Europe will fall under Gog's political control, verse 6 implies that the West Bank will be part of Israel proper, which of course means that at some point in time Israel is going to annex the West Bank, because Gog comes down upon the mountains of Israel, not the mountains of a Palestinian state, the mountains of Israel, and 90% of the mountains of Israel are in the West Bank. So Israel will eventually annex the West Bank. Israel will be at peace, both internally and with its near neighbours. We know that from verses 8 to 11. In fact, they're going to be caught off guard, so peaceful will it be for Israel at that time. Israel will also be very prosperous and will be envied by other nations, as verse 12 tells us. And Britain will be allied with its former colonies in opposition to Gog, verse 13. And the Arabian Peninsula states, the Sheba and the Dedan, will be associated with the Tarshish powers in opposition to Gog. So they're just a few things that Ezekiel 38 requires. Well, you know, when God goes to work, he always puts the right people in position. I don't know whether Vladimir Putin will be the Gog of Ezekiel 38 verse 2. But what I do know is this, that he has been put there to establish the kind of dictatorship required by Ezekiel 38 verse 2 and Habakkuk chapter 2. Now whether he's the man, and of course he could potentially be in power until 2024, only time will tell. But what he has established is unquestionably what the scripture requires to be in place prior to Armageddon. Now you've had a chance to have a look at what's on the screen there. He's arisen out of obscurity, this man. He's come from nowhere, from being a relatively lowly KGB colonel in East Germany. He became in turn the head of the KGB, or the FSB as it's now called, same thing. Then he became Prime Minister in late 1999, and then by 2000, of course, he became President. He had the presidency handed to him by Boris Yeltsin. So the latter-day dictator of Ezekiel 38 is further described for us in Habakkuk chapter 2. Now you see what it says about him, and we'll go into a bit more detail in a moment. You see what it says about him in verses 5 and 6. We won't read it all again, just the last couple of lines of verse 5 says, but he gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. And I'm going to read the last couple of lines of verse 6. It says this, and to him that ladeth himself with thick clay. Now in the Hebrew, that phrase thick clay means pledges of allegiance. So he brings nations to himself, and the methodology that he uses is to put them under some kind of debt, so that they make pledges of allegiance to him. Now we've just seen that, haven't we? $15 billion worth of pledges that he made to get Ukraine out of its bankruptcy mess, which of course he's not paying right now because Ukraine's being ruled by someone else. Yanukovych was the man he made the contract with, but Yanukovych is no longer in power, so he's withdrawn. At least he's not paying the tranches of that 15 billion, so Ukraine is in deep financial trouble as a result of that. But this is the methodology of this dictator of Habakkuk chapter 2. He puts nations under his control through pledges of allegiance. Well, I believe we've got that kind of dictatorship, and we may well have the man himself. Now, what is Habakkuk 2 about? If you were to give a thumbnail sketch of what this chapter was about, you would say, as Tim rightly said in his introductory comments to the reading, that this is about the times of Habakkuk when a Chaldean dictator was to come down and to bring judgments upon God's people. Well, that's true. That's its background. That's the basis of it. But this chapter is really about our time and the time beyond us, the establishment of the kingdom. How do we know that? Well, verse 3 talks about an appointed time. It will surely come. And that passage is quoted, of course, elsewhere in the context of the return of Christ. Verse 4, the faithful have a sure destiny. The just will live by faith, we are told. Verse 14, the earth should be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. You can't mistake that, can you? And verse 20, Yahweh is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. Do they keep silence today? No. So Habakkuk chapter 2 is about the future. It's about the establishment of the kingdom. And therefore, the dictator in this chapter, he was a forerunner of the latter day dictator that will come down upon the land of Israel. And of course we know that Habakkuk chapter 3 is actually a psalm detailing the march of the rainbow angel, and ends with the words of verses 18 and 19. Verse 18 says, yet I will rejoice in Yahweh, I will joy in the God of my salvation. So this is about the establishment of the kingdom. So what do we find in this chapter? Well, we find in verse 4 a corrupt Chaldean oppressor. In verse 5, he's noted for drunkenness, pride, expansionism. He's insatiable, and he is a dictator. In verse 6, he uses the methods of coercion and blackmail. They're his favourite tools to control other nations. In verse 8, he uses ruthlessness in spoiling nations and cities and innocent people. You know how Putin, what the very first thing he did as Prime Minister? He ordered an attack on Chechnya. And literally hundreds of thousands of people were made homeless and many tens of thousands died. That was his first act. It was his way of showing that he had power. So that's the kind of thing that this man has shown. Verse 9, he uses religion to hide and to justify his actions. More about that in a moment. Verse 12, he builds his empire by fire and blood. Verse 15, he uses base practices to undermine others. And some of you might have heard me say this before, but in the middle of the 1990s, or towards the end of the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin, who was then president of Russia, was in trouble. He was in trouble because his family were fiddling the books in Russia. They had their hand in the till. And so Yeltsin he knew that he might not live out, he might not serve out his term as president. And Yevgeny Primakov was made Prime Minister. And Primakov wanted to make a name for himself. So he appointed a prosecutor who set about investigating the Yeltsin family. He found evidence, clear evidence, that they were fiddling the books, and Yeltsin heard about it. It was going to be presented in Parliament. So he rang Mr. Putin, who'd just been made the head of the KGB. He says, Vladimir, I'm in trouble. Can you help me? Putin said, leave it to me, boss, I can handle it. He set up a safe KGB house near the Kremlin. He put 2 women of the darker side of humanity, harlots, in that house. He filled the fridge with vodka and other strong drink. He got the prosecutor in there, and the rest is history, because it was played live on Russian television. That man's activities in that house were live on Russian television. What did verse 15 and 16 say? Thou puttest the bottle that thou mayest look upon his nakedness. That's exactly how he came to power. Because when Yeltsin came to the end of his term, who was he going to give the job of president to? The man who saved his neck. So he handed the briefcase with the nuclear codes in it to Vladimir Putin. Well, he had to face an election, but it was all over. Putin became the president of Russia, exactly as Habakkuk 2 verses 15 and 16 describe. That's how this man operates. Verses 18 and 19, he's an image worshipper. Yes, you know that Putin was in the Vatican on the 25th of November last year, but he presented Francis I with an image of the icon of the Madonna of Vladimir, very appropriately named, I think. A very important religious icon for the Russian Orthodox Church, which of course he kissed. When he was made president in 2000, he kissed this very image. Well, he brought a copy to Francis I and kissed it in front of him. You know, he's as religious as my big toe. Putin, he is a brutal thug. That's what he is. He was a street fighter as a boy and a teenager. He beat people up ruthlessly, and he's been doing the same ever since. He's got no religion in him at all, but he uses religion as a vehicle to promote his own interests. This is how he came to power.
In March 2000, Vladimir Putin, an obscure ex-KGB man, is elected as president of Russia.
Patriotic and fascinated by Tsarist imperialism in his youth, Vladimir Putin was also deeply influenced by the Soviet regime. The country that has elected him is thirsty for a new hero who will revive national strength and pride. Even the memories of Stalin's purges seem obliterated by disillusion with the present. The Russian people are nostalgic for past glory. 30 years after dreaming of becoming a secret agent, Vladimir Putin has discreetly climbed all the steps which lead to power.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
The KGB, the Russian Secret Service, now called the FSB, teaches him rigor and method, a system. His political mentor, President Yuri Andropov, gives him his vision of the role of the state and the organization of the economy. Posted to East Germany, he becomes a lieutenant colonel and encounters the world of business. The fall of the Berlin Wall and of the USSR see the birth of his mission to restore respect for his country in the world. A native of St. Petersburg, he owes his political career to its Democrat mayor, Anatoly Sobchak, and later to Boris Yeltsin. His apparent loyalty towards these men is at the core of his system.
Throughout all these years, Vladimir Putin has observed and analyzed the arcane mysteries of power, never openly showing any ambition to replace his superior. Today, he has reached his secret goal.
Уважать и охранять права и свободы человека и гражданина.
Within the secrecy of the Kremlin walls, the leader and his cabal control the state, the economy, and the destiny of the people. Vladimir Putin has succeeded in his mission. He has established the vertical of power, stabilized the economy, and made Russia an important player on the world stage again. Whatever Putin's regime be called, dictocracy or militocracy, his chosen successor will continue to perpetrate his system, privatizing the state with former members of the KGB.
You have a bit of a feel, don't you, for how he came to power? Well, what about the Ukraine? We read in Ezekiel 38 and at verse 2 that Gog means the one at the top, the roof, in other words, a dictator, a single man who sits at the top, like Putin now does and rules through the secret police. That's a Tsarist-style dictatorship. That's what existed in Russia up till 1917. That's back. We read of him that Gog is of the land of Magog, prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal. Well, the land of Magog is said to be this area bounded here by the red. And a portion of that land is the country of Ukraine. So the current problems there are very interesting in terms of Bible prophecy. I want to explain why that is the case. Here's the history of Russia. In AD 862, a man called Rurik, a Viking chieftain, assumed control of the Slavic kingdoms in Europe that came to be known as the land of the Rus. We're going to see in a moment where they set their capital up, because in 989, Grand Prince Vladimir I of Kiev converted to Christianity. The new religion soon spread to other Russian principalities. In 1240, Russia was to go through a couple of hundred years of difficulty when the Mongols came and took over that entire land mass. But in 1480, a man arose whom I believe Putin is patterning himself upon. He was called in history Ivan III, but he's known as Ivan the Great. He ruled from Moscow, he freed Russia from Mongol control, and he was called the Grand Prince of all the Rus and the gatherer of the Russian lands. He tripled the possessions of Russia during his 30 or 40 year reign. In fact, he got rid of a few of his competitors, his brothers. He sort of got rid of them nicely, and they disappeared. So here was a man who knew how to get rid of competitors, who knew how to multiply territory, who knew how to bring back together the original Russian lands. Now, the Rus originally settled on the western side of the river Volga, which runs into the Caspian Sea. In other words, in Ukraine. That's where the Rus originally were, and the first capital of the Russian nation was Kiev, the current capital of Ukraine. Now, this is what commentators are saying. Andrew Wilson, author of Ukraine's Orange Revolution, which you're going to hear a bit more about in a second, writing on the 23rd of February 2014, said, "A real democracy in Ukraine is an existential threat to the entire system that Vladimir Putin has built since 2000. That's why he's not going to let them go." Leonid Kravchuk, Ukraine's first post-Soviet president, back in the early 1990s, said in February this year, Russia, understanding that without Ukraine it would not be able to take its place in the wider arena of Europe and create a new, powerful structure that could counterbalance the United States and others, and this is Russia's goal, made the strategic decision to keep Ukraine in its embrace. That's why Putin has done what he's done in the last few weeks. Now, one of the critical factors, and there are a number of critical factors as to why Putin wants to retain control over Ukraine. One, of course, is that it's part of the Russian Empire. You can't have a Russian Empire without its original home base. It's got to be there. So it's like having a nation that wants to be an empire, but you don't have the original capital. It's gone. No, that can't happen. There's a lot of pipes that go through Ukraine as well, carrying oil and gas. You'll see that in a minute. But here is the other reason. This is the pressing reason right now. Sevastopol. Sevastopol is a city on the Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainian port is currently leased to Russia. So Ukraine owns it and they lease it to the Russians. It's the heart of Russia's activity through the entire Mediterranean region. It is, in fact, their only warm water port. This is Putin's dilemma. They spent a lot of money. They had 50,000 Russians in Syria building the port of Tartus after they'd completed the port of Latakia to the north. Tartus was going to be their primary base in the Mediterranean. It's under the command of the naval command in Sevastopol. And of course, Tartus is a safe harbour for 11 of Russia's most modern warships, the ones that they intend to use in due course. So the loss of Sevastopol, its only warm water port, would be absolutely catastrophic for Russia's Mediterranean navy. Of course, Syria is in deep trouble. So if they lose Sevastopol, then their entire navy is manacled in the Mediterranean. The Ukraine and Syria, of course, are therefore strategically linked in the Russian mind and are very vital interests for them. So that's why, a few days ago, Putin put Russian troops in the Crimean Peninsula. Now, of course, when people came to him and said, well, why did you put troops there? Well, they're not my troops, he said. They are local self-defence forces. Yeah, pull the other leg. They are Russians. You want to have a look at the equipment they've got. It's all brand spanking new. They're driving these, you could see your face on the side of the truck. It's that new. Highly polished. Do local defence forces have that kind of money? Of course they don't. Look at these guys. They just come out of the shop. They killed it up, haven't they? Local defence forces? Come on. Pull the other leg. But of course that's the story he's telling the world. They are Russian troops. You know what they've done? They've surrounded the military bases of the Ukrainian army so they can't go anywhere. And some of the Ukrainian soldiers came out to try and get through, and they pointed guns at them and said, "Get back, otherwise you're dead." That's what they're doing right now. You know, on the 5th of March 2014, what's today? 5th of March today? Right. This is what happened today. Or at least happened the last day or so, reported today. 8 Turkish F-16 fighter jets intercepted a Russian reconnaissance plane that had flown parallel to the Turkish coast in international airspace on Tuesday. Turkey's foreign minister said on Monday that Turkey will always stand by the Crimean Tatars as he met with nearly 50 representatives of Crimean associations. Of course, they're up in arms because of the Russian presence in the Crimean. We cannot stay indifferent, he said, to any matter related to our compatriots in Crimea or anywhere in the world. The Crimean Tatars fear exile again if the Crimea region of Ukraine is going to stay occupied by Russia. Sounds like echoes of the Crimean War to me, of 1853 to 1856, when the fading Turkish Empire had to be supported by the British and the French and others against Russia that wanted to take control of the Crimean. It's happening all over again. Well, of course, we know that the outcome is going to be somewhat different. We want to talk about that as we proceed tonight. So you see, we know, of course, that eventually Russia is going to take control of Turkey, and they're building up a list of things that are grievances against Turkey, and there are many of them, including, of course, Armenia and the Armenian genocide of 1919. All of those things will come to the fore when Russia finally makes its decision to attack Turkey. But that's some time away, as you're going to see later on. Ukraine, therefore, is integral to Russia. As we said, the Rus first established Kiev as the capital of the land of the Rus. And in 2004, Ukraine elected a democratic European-inclined president. He was poisoned, of course, as you're probably aware, prior to the election. Putin's ally, Yanukovych, who stood in that election back in 2004, was defeated, and Putin was utterly humiliated. I want you to have a look in a moment, the look on that man's face. Have a look at Putin's face when his candidate, Yanukovych, was defeated in the election. See if you can see revenge in that man's face. He retaliated in January 2006 in the middle of a very severe winter by cutting off gas to the Ukraine. The latest blackmail, of course, is a $15 billion loan designed to head off Ukraine's drift towards the European Union. So here they were in Moscow a little while back when the $15 billion deal was done to dig Ukraine out of its terrible debt situation. Yanukovych on the left. Have a look at the face on Putin on the right. And then have a look at this.
Ukraine, symbolically and strategically the most important of these countries, is at the crossroads for the transit of Russian oil and gas to Europe. The Ukrainian presidential elections are in October 2004. The pro-Russian authoritarian regime is in difficulty. But Putin has no intention of letting Ukraine choose the path to democracy. The FSB and Putin's advisors collaborate closely with Ukrainian intelligence services to ensure the victory of Putin's protege, Viktor Yanukovych. At the climax of the election campaign, Viktor Yushchenko, the pro-Western candidate, is poisoned and badly disfigured. But this doesn't deter him or the Ukrainian people. On the 20th of December, after an agitated poll, the Orange Revolution leads him to victory.
For Putin, it is more than a failure. It's a humiliation. But there are other ways to show Ukraine that she will not escape from Russia's hold.
On the 1st of January 2006, the Kremlin cuts off the gas supplies to Ukraine.
this action was from the beginning intended to show the Ukraine and Europe how powerful Russia is in terms of its influence with regard to gas supplies.
But the Kremlin's blackmail has only just begun. Parliamentary elections are coming up, and Russia continues its intimidation by stopping the importation of Ukrainian goods. Putin's message is clear. The pro-Russian Yanukovych must become prime minister. If the Ukrainians vote for his party, everything will return to normal. Today, the deed is done. Yanukovych is prime minister, and Ukraine is moving away from Europe and NATO. In Ukraine, Putin demonstrates his capacity to use any means to transform a failure into victory.
Might we not be watching, brothers and sisters and young people, the latter-day Chaldean dictator of Habakkuk chapter 2, binding nations to himself by pledges of allegiance extracted by blackmail and coercion? I think we are. I think we've got the man, we've certainly got the system. Time will tell whether he's still there when, of course, our Lord Jesus Christ will confront him, or at least go